They thought burning his barn would erase him. But that night, something older than justice woke up in the soil. And by sunrise, the town was on its knees, not him. They used to call him Eli Booker, back when names still meant something in the South. His land stretched across rust-colored hills in Claymore County, the only black-owned farm for 100 miles, passed down from his grandfather, bought with sweat, blood, and coin scraped during sharecropping days. It wasn't just soil. It was history. It was home. But in towns like Claymore, black ownership was a threat, not to law but to pride. To men who wore Confederate flags on their hats and claimed this land was meant for their kind. Eli kept to himself, woke up before the sun, worked with calloused hands and quiet prayers. The wind carried the sound of gospel, but behind it, always whispers. People said he was too proud. Said he had no right to claim that much space. Said things a little louder every year. Until the day 4 trucks rolled up his dirt road, headlights on in broad daylight, and something broke in the air. They didn't knock. They didn't ask. They just came, with rifles slung over their shoulders and that sick, slow smirk of men who thought they'd never be touched by consequence. Eli had just finished mending the wire fence along the cattle line. He heard the rumble of tires before he saw their faces. Faces he knew, from the feed store, from the diner that never served him coffee hot, from the gas station where they whispered, "Boy," just loud enough for him to hear. The leader stepped forward. Gunner Reeves, sheriff's cousin, a local man whose granddaddy once owned 6 families and still thought the world owed him silence. "You've been getting too comfortable, Booker," Gunner said, spitting tobacco on Eli's front porch. "You think you can sit out here on this land, all proud and quiet, like we forgot who this belonged to?" Eli didn't move, didn't blink. He just stared, the way a mountain stares at a storm. Gunner laughed, but his eyes stayed cold. "Folks around here think it's time you leave. Sell the land, or things might get uncomfortable." Behind him, the other men shifted. Their boots weren't just heavy, they were hungry. One of them kicked over a planter box. Another broke a window with his elbow and smiled while doing it. But Eli didn't flinch. He didn't beg. He didn't run. He just said one sentence, low, steady, as if carved from stone. "This land has buried braver men than you." That's when Gunner snapped. He pushed Eli down the steps, laughed as he landed in the dust. And when Eli stood back up, bleeding, bruised, but breathing, they realized something. He wasn't afraid. They'd beat him anyway. Not to win, but to remind him that men like them never needed a reason, just an audience. When they left, Eli lay still. One eye swollen shut, a rib cracked, but his mind sharper than ever. And the first thing he did when the dust settled was crawl to the house, pull the old rotary phone from under the counter, and dial a number he hadn't used in 22 years. It rang once, twice, then a voice picked up, gravelly, steady, familiar. "This is Mason." Eli said only 5 words. "I need the whole team." Silence. "Then we'll be there by sunup." He hung up, sat in the blood-soaked silence of his kitchen floor, and whispered the same words his grandfather once told him, long ago under that same roof. "You never fight fire with fear. You fight it with memory." By the time the sky turned copper with sunrise, 3 blacked-out SUVs pulled up Eli's gravel path. No sirens, no noise, just presence. Out stepped 4 men, diverse in color, build, and story, but united by something deeper than blood. Loyalty forged in war. Mason Valerio walked first. Broad frame, salt and pepper beard, and the kind of stare that made lesser men forget how to lie. Puerto Rican by blood, Marine recon by fire. He hadn't seen Eli since the last mission in Basra, but here he was, like they'd never left that battlefield. Behind him came Langston, a quiet, sharp-eyed sniper from Chicago. Then Torres, a medic with scarred hands and no patience for cruelty. And finally Delroy, West Indies-born ex-intel, with a smile that never reached his eyes. They didn't ask what happened. They saw the bruises, the boarded-up windows, the kicked-in door. They understood. Mason sat across from Eli at the old pine table, the same one where Eli's mother used to serve cornbread, now stained with blood, now a war table again. You still remember that little church in Fallujah? Mason asked quietly. Eli nodded. That's when I knew I'd follow you anywhere. Mason leaned forward. Then say the word. We don't need permission. Eli exhaled slow. I don't want revenge, he said. I want respect. I want them to know this soil has history deeper than their hatred. Langston spoke for the first time. They'll never listen until they feel what they've made others feel. Eli looked up. I want the town to see. Not a fight, not a war. I want them to see who I am and what they tried to erase. The room went still. Mason grinned. Then we build the reckoning slow. That afternoon, they got to work. Rebuilt the broken fences. Cleaned the porch. Painted the name Booker back on the mailbox in bold black strokes. The neighbors watched. Whispers rose. Phones clicked. But no one dared come close. That night, they lit a bonfire. Not to threaten, but to remind. Eli stood tall beneath the blaze. Wore his father's jacket. Held his grandfather's Bible. The team stood behind him, not as soldiers, as brothers. And across the field in the dark, Gunner Reeves watched, from the cab of his truck, hand tight on his pistol, eyes narrow with something new, uncertainty. Because this wasn't fear anymore. This was legacy. And legacy doesn't kneel. The next morning, the church bells rang like any Sunday, but the pews in Claymore were quieter than usual. People sat stiff, eyes shifting toward the back window, where a plume of smoke still drifted from Eli's land. Not fire, not trouble, just the smell of reclaimed pride. Whispers ran wild in grocery aisles, at barber chairs, and behind whitewashed fences. They say he called in some black ops gang. Navy men, former military. Should have known he'd stir things up. Should have stayed in his place. But what nobody said out loud was that Eli was no longer alone. And at Scare-Them.at, the feed store, Eli walked in like he always had, calm, composed, head high. But this time, he wasn't invisible. People moved, not out of respect, out of uncertainty. Old Mr. Halford, owner of the place, once known for refusing to shake Eli's hand, now greeted him with a stiff nod. Eli didn't nod back that he picked up 2 sacks of seed, laid them on the counter, and before paying looked Halford in the eye. You ever been beat for just existing, Mr. Halford? His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Halford swallowed hard. No, sir. Can't say I have. Eli leaned closer. Then don't look at me like you know what kind of man I am. He paid in full, walked out in silence. The whole store watched. Back on his land, the team was building something. Not a fence, not a bunker, a stage. Wooden, simple, wide. On it, they painted a banner. History lives here. Langston had gotten footage. Security cam clips. Voice recordings. Even phone footage from neighbors who secretly filmed the gang attack. Not to help, but to share. Now it was time to let the town watch itself. No weapons. Just truth. Unedited. Projected on a screen under the stars. Mason called it the Night of Memory. When the townspeople arrived, some curious, some cautious, they saw chairs, popcorn stands, free entry, and Eli standing near the fire pit, calm and present. No uniform, no anger, just history ready to be told. At first, the footage played slow, then harder, then the audio hit. You think you can own this land, boy? Crack, punch, laugh. We'll teach you respect. A hush spread. Even the children looked around, unsure why grown-ups were frozen. Gunner wasn't there, but his face, his voice, his cruelty was unfiltered, and the town couldn't look away. Eli stepped forward after the clip ended, voice calm, eyes wet but steady. I'm not here to beg. I'm not here for pity. I'm here to remind you all, this land didn't grow from hate. It grew from survival, from stories buried in the dirt that still remember the sound of chains and the whisper of men who swore it would never be ours. No one clapped, no one cheered, but no one left, because sometimes the truth doesn't need applause. It just needs to be seen. The night after the footage was shown, Claymore was different, not loud, not explosive, but quieter, like a town holding its breath, waiting to see if history would repeat or finally break. Gunner Reeves didn't show up at church, didn't show up at the bar, didn't answer calls. He was hiding, not out of fear but out of calculation. Men like him don't vanish. They wait, they plot, they convince themselves they're still in control, until the world reminds them otherwise. 3 days later, the fire started. A barn, Eli's, engulfed in flame before the rooster even crowed. By the time he reached it, half the structure had collapsed. Cattle panicked. Smoke swallowed the sky. Mason tried to call 911, but the line was dead. Langston grabbed a fire extinguisher. Torres herded the animals. Delroy scanned the tree-line with trained eyes. And Eli, he just stood there, watching his grandfather's tools melt in the blaze, watching the barn his father built crack and scream. They had sent a message. Again. And this time, it wasn't just about land. It was about control, punishment, erasure. Sheriff Carson arrived 40 minutes late, said his radio had been down. His tone flat, eyes careful. He looked at the smoldering barn, then at Eli. No proof it was arson, he said. Eli didn't flinch, didn't shout. He simply asked, "What was gonna last night?" The sheriff stiffened. "You accusing someone?" "No," Eli said. "I'm remembering." The sheriff tried to pivot. "Look, Eli, stirring up the town like this." Eli cut him off, voice sharp as cut glass. "You mean showing them the truth?" The sheriff hesitated, then tipped his hat and walked away. And that was the moment Eli knew. The law wouldn't protect him, but memory would. That night, the men didn't sleep. They fortified the perimeter. That night, the men didn't sleep. They fortified the perimeter. Torres installed motion sensors. Langston cleaned his old rifle. Delroy hacked the town surveillance grid, linking every feed within a 5-mile radius. Eli, meanwhile, walked the land barefoot, felt the soil under him, listened to the wind through broken wood, and whispered names of his ancestors, as if each footstep stitched him deeper into the earth. When he returned to the house, Mason was waiting. "We don't need to stay," Mason said. "We'll send a lawyer. Buy new land. Safer land." Eli shook his head. "This is a land they want erased," he said. "This is the one I stay on." They came at 2:17 a.m. 5 trucks. No headlights. This time, more men, faces covered, weapons drawn, Confederate flags fluttering from the antennas. But what they didn't know was that every inch of that land was being recorded, broadcasted, live. Delroy had set up a private server. Langston's feed was streaming directly to dozens of inboxes, including the regional news network and a civil rights attorney in Atlanta. The first shot missed. The second didn't. It hit the porch, splinters flying. Eli didn't duck, didn't scream. He walked into the light, hands open, voice firm. "Drop your guns." Their eyes watching. Not mine, the world's. Gunner Reeves stepped from behind the truck, face half lit. "I warned you," he growled. "You embarrass me. You think you're better than us." Eli laughed once. "No, I think I'm the proof you failed." Gunner's hand twitched toward the trigger, but Mason fired first. A warning shot, right at Gunner's feet. The gang scattered. Langston's drone caught every angle. Torres had already dialed press contacts. Delroy uploaded the footage mid-attack. It was over before it began. By sunrise, #Bookerland trended across the nation. By noon, the governor issued a statement. By dusk, Gunner and 3 others were arrested, not just for arson, but federal hate crimes. The town didn't say sorry. Not out loud. But silence took on a new shape that Eli's neighbors started leaving baked goods at his porch. Not to bribe, but to acknowledge. Children waved from passing school buses. Teachers invited Eli to speak about land and legacy. Sheriff Carson resigned, replaced by a black woman from a nearby county who remembered what Claymore once tried to forget. And on a warm Sunday morning, Eli stood under the rebuilt barn, Mason beside him, Langston holding a camera, Torres and Delroy laughing near the grill. He read from his grandfather's Bible again, but this time to a crowd, neighbors, activists, reporters, strangers who'd driven for hours to stand on ground that refused to kneel. "My name is Eli Booker," he said. voice steady. And this land doesn't belong to hate. It belongs to memory, to survival, to us. And in that moment, Claymore became something it had never dared to be. Seen. Weeks passed. The land healed slower than the wounds, but healed nonetheless. Wildflowers returned where ash had settled. Fences stood taller. The barn, now stronger than before, smelled of fresh cedar and quiet defiance. Children from town came with notebooks, sketching trees, and listening to Eli speak about how dirt can remember what men tried to erase. But for Eli, healing was never loud. It was in the small moments. The creak of the porch that didn't break this time. The sound of gospel music playing from his grandmother's old record player. The way the wind moved through the fields like it was apologizing. Mason had stayed a few extra weeks. He'd taken up whittling again. Said he liked how the wood didn't fight back. "You ever going to retire from being the backbone of this place?" He joked one morning. Eli didn't look up. Backbones don't retire. They just grow roots. Mason laughed. But behind that laugh was something heavier. Awe, respect, maybe even guilt that he knew Eli could have walked away. Could have started fresh somewhere safer, quieter. But he stayed. And that meant something more than headlines. More than trending tags or interviews. It meant legacy. Torres returned to the border to continue his clinic work. Langston took a contract filming forgotten communities. Delroy launched a digital archive project. His first post was titled, "How to Outlive Hate." But before leaving, each of them did one thing. They planted a single tree on Eli's land. Not for beauty, not even for shade, but for memory that Mason's was an oak, tall, defiant, a soldier's tree. Langston's a willow, quiet, watchful, always bending but never breaking. Torres chose a fruit tree. Delroy a flame tree, its red petals bold against blue skies. Eli planted his last. A pecan, the same kind his grandfather once picked by hand under the sun that never forgave, but always watched the town change in ripples. Not everyone clapped at the progress, but some opened their eyes. A local librarian started a Black History section. A school replaced the name of a Confederate general with Booker Elementary. And sometimes, the same people who whispered hate years ago stood silently at town hall meetings as Eli spoke about land rights, generational wealth, and the difference between law and justice. They didn't always agree, but they listened, and that was enough to begin point one evening. While standing on his porch alone, Eli watched a young boy ride past on his bike. The boy, caramel-skinned and wide-eyed, waved without hesitation. Eli waved back. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something new in the pit of his chest. Peace. Not the peace that comes from quiet, but the kind that's earned through scars, loss, and standing your ground when the world demanded you shrink. He sat down on the porch, closed his eyes, listened to the wind again. But this time, it didn't sound like warning. It sounded like forgiveness. Years later, people would drive through Claymore and barely recognize the silence it once held. No one talked much about the barn that burned, or the men who tried to bury a man in the soil he was born from. But they remembered the tree line. They remembered the names carved into wooden signs near the entrance of Booker Ranch. Not names of presidents, not generals, but people who had been invisible and stood anyway. Eli Booker became something more than a farmer. He was a keeper of echoes. When college students came, he welcomed them. When politicians visited for photo ops, he gave them a cup of water and asked one question. "Do you know who grew the cotton in your shirt?" Some stammered. Others turned and left. But a few stayed and listened. In the living room of his home, beside the firewood stack, sat a small frame. Inside it was a photograph. Faded now. 5 men, dust on their boots, dirt under their fingernails. Shoulders closed, not from pose, but from purpose. It was Eli and his squad. The ones who didn't just fight wars in deserts far away, but fought for dignity right here, in a field where crosses once leaned crooked in fear. Sometimes, when the sun was just right, Eli would take a walk to the pecan tree. It stood taller now, sturdier. Its roots had pushed deep, wrapping around the remnants of the old barn foundation, as if the earth itself had decided to protect what remained. He'd place one hand on the bark and close his eyes. "I remember you," he'd whisper, to his father, to the boy he once was, to the fear that tried to settle but never stayed. And on the anniversary of that night, the one with fire, gunshots, and truth, he would host what he called the gathering. No speeches, no press, just stories. People came. From cities, towns, reservations, the islands. They brought their scars, their music, their grandmother's recipes. Children danced barefoot in the grass. Elders told stories of towns they once had to flee. And in the center of it all, Eli sat, not as a hero, but as a soil, quiet, rooted, listening. One year, a young girl stood during the gathering, brown skin, braids, and a question in her eyes. She said, "Mr. Booker, how did you stay when they wanted you gone?" Eli looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Because I was never alone. Because when hate came with torches, I had ancestors standing behind me, and brothers beside me who knew silence was the most dangerous weapon of all. Because this land already belonged to us." He looked up at the stars. "And I stayed, so you wouldn't have to ask that question again." The girl nodded, then smiled. And somewhere in the wind, just past the fence line, you could almost hear a voice whisper, "You did good, Eli. Real good. The land no longer aches. It breathes. And for the first time in generations, the story is still here. And so are its people.